Chapter 5, Digging Deeper, From Surface to Depth Phenomenology. One way to appraise the development of phenomenology is to see it as a continuous expansion, deepening, and complexification of the basic phenomenological analysis that we find in Husserl's early work. Husserl himself eventually came to label the kind of phenomenology he initially had conducted as static phenomenology. If we consider some of the early formative analysis of perceptual intentionality and of the relation between perception and imagination, they all studied the intentional correlation with no regard for genesis and historicity. The type of object and the type of intentional act were both considered readily available. Subsequently, however, Husserl came to realize that the subject of intentionality is not merely a formal principle of constitution. It is not, as he puts it, a dead pole of identity. And the same holds true on the object side. Husserl went on to imagine how patterns of understanding are gradually established and how they come to influence and enable subsequent experiences. Through a process of sedimentation, our experiences leave their trace in us, and thereby continue to the formation and cognitive schemas and diverse forms of apprehension and expectations that guide and motivate subsequent experiences. Certain types of intentionality, pre-linguistic experiences, for example, condition later and more complex types of intentionality, conceptual judgments, for instance. What the heck is that sentence? Certain types of intentionality condition later and more complex types of intentionality. And Husserl took the task of what he eventually called genetic phenomenology to involve the examination of the temporal becoming of these different forms of intentionality, one that also traced higher order forms of objectivity back to lower order forms. The scope of genetic phenomenology remained restricted to the experiential life of an individual ego. However, in the last phase of his thinking, Husserl ventured into what has been called generative phenomenology. The focus was broadened to investigate the constitutive role of tradition and history. In what way are the accomplishments of previous generations operative in our individual experiences? As Husserl would put it in a manuscript from the 20s, everything of my own is founded, in part through the tradition of my ancestors, and part through the tradition of my contemporaries. Generativity and tradition. One way this development is traced out in Husserl's own writings is through an increased focus on how the topics of embodiment, temporality, and sociality are intertwined. As we have already seen, Husserl argued that the body is essentially involved in the perception of and interaction with spatial objects. For him, the world is given to us as bodily explored, and the body is revealed to us in its exploration of the world. Already early on, Husserl already came to realize the importance of temporality, and defended the view that an investigation of intentionality will remain incomplete as long as one ignores the temporal dimension of the intentional acts and intentional objects. In addition, Husserl was one of the first philosophers to employ and discuss the notion of intersubjectivity in a comprehensive and systematic manner. He worked on empathy for more than 3 decades and would eventually declare that phenomenology had to develop from an egological phenomenology to a sociological phenomenology. In Husserl's last writings, the topics of embodiment, intersubjectivity, and temporality are brought and thought together. There is also a diachronic dimension to intersubjectivity. Ultimately, Husserl would have considered the subject's birth into a living tradition to have constitutive implications. It is not merely the case that I live in a world which is permeated by references to others, and which others have already furnished with meaning, or that I understand the world and myself through a traditional handed-down linguistic conventionality. The very meaning of the world for me is such that it has its origins outside of me in a historical past. As Husserl writes in Crisis, being embedded in the unitary flow of a historical development in a generative nexus of birth and death belongs as indissolubly to the I as does its temporal form. Oof. The fact that Husserl eventually came to include topics such as embodiment, historicity, and intersubjectivity in his transcendental analysis is one of the reasons why Merleau-Ponty, in the preface to Phenomenology of Perception, could write, Husserl's transcendental is not Kant's. Husserl's late ideas regarding the intertwinement between self and others and world is, from early on, also pursued by Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, who likewise insist that self, world, and others belong together, that they reciprocally illuminate one another and can only be understood in their interconnection. In an early lecture, Heidegger describes the life world as an penetration of the three domains: surrounding world, with world, and self-world, and argues that Dasein as world experiencing is already being with others. As he would put it in later lectures from 1927, Dasein is just as little at first merely a dwelling among things, so as then occasionally to discover among these things beings with its own kind of being. Instead, as the being which is occupied with itself, the Dasein is with equal originality, being with others and being among intraworldly beings. I want to read that again. Dasein is just as little at first merely a dwelling among things, so as then occasionally to discover among these things beings with its own kind of being. Instead, as the being which is occupied with itself, Dasein is with equal originality, being with others and being among intraworldly beings. On with the distinction between being with others and being among intraworldly beings. As for Merleau-Ponty, he argues that subjectivity is essentially oriented and open toward that which it is not, and that it is in this openness that it reveals itself to itself. What is disclosed by a phenomenological reflection is, consequentially, not a self-enclosed mind, a pure interior self-presence, but an openness toward otherness, a movement of exteriorization, and perceptual self-transcendence. It is by being present to the world that we are present to ourselves, and it is by being given to ourselves that we can be conscious of the world. Merleau-Ponty consequently insists that a phenomenological description, rather than disclosing subjectivities that are inaccessible and self-sufficient, reveals continuities between intersubjective life and the world. Oof. So good. The subject is present to itself, to the world, and to others, not in spite of, but precisely by way of its corporality and historicity. As Merleau-Ponty fully realizes, such a conception of the intertwinement of self, others, and world affects the very conception of transcendental philosophy. How can the borders of the transcendental and the empirical help becoming indistinct? For along with the other person, all the other person sees of me, all my facticity, is reintegrated into subjectivity, or at least posited as an indispensable element of its definition. Thus the transcendental descends into history, or as we might put it, the historical is no longer an external relation between two or more absolutely autonomous subjects, but has an interior and an inherent aspect of their very definition. Whoa! History has an interior. That's not the first time I've ran into that, but that's the first time I've heard it put so bluntly. Oh, okay, so it's the subjectivation. Subjectivation is historical, meaning that the historical itself is in part, what was the word? Interior. Oh, that's cool. All right. And is an inherent aspect of their very definition. Oh, yeah. They no longer know themselves to be subjects simply in relation to their individual selves, but in relation to one another as well. How does the phenomenological work of Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger diverge from that of Husserl? One way to conceive of the divergence is by seeing both as pursuing ideas already found in Husserl in a more radical manner than Husserl himself. Merleau-Ponty attributes more significance to the role of embodiment and facticity, i.e., the contingent situatedness of our existence, than Husserl. And is also going further in his attempt to rethink the traditional divide between the transcendental and the empirical, and between mind and worlds. That's strange. More significance. I thought it was, what is it? Like a coextensive. It's, mind and world are equally coextensive. So it's weird to think that more would be placed on one. This is already evident in Merleau-Ponty's first major work, The Structure of Behavior, where Merleau-Ponty engages extensively with empirical science and on the final page calls for a redefinition of transcendental philosophy. Rather than making us choose between a scientific explanation and a phenomenological reflection, Merleau-Ponty asks us to respect the living relation between consciousness and nature, and to search for a dimension that is beyond both objectivism and subjectivism. Okay, that's way more reasonable sounding than just more significance on, like, facticity. Because that it sounded exclusive, like it was excluding some aspect or another. Anyway, glad it's not. Heidegger is a more attentive reader of the history of philosophy than Husserl, and is also, to a larger extent than Husserl, emphasizing the extent to which our current thinking is influenced by the tradition. For Heidegger, one important task of phenomenology is to disclose and deconstruct some of the metaphysical conceptions that for centuries have tacitly framed and constrained philosophical thinking. In the course of his own phenomenological analysis, Heidegger comes to question the traditional privilege of the theoretical attitude, of object-givenness, and of temporal presence. He argues that one of Husserl's limitations was that he remained too focused on logical and epistemological issues, and thereby operated with too narrow a concept of being and givenness. Rather than letting his investigation be guided by the things themselves, Husserl was, according to Heidegger, instead led by traditional, or to be more specific, by Cartesian presuppositions and decisions. By privileging the active ego and by reducing givenness to object-givenness, Husserl not only failed to disclose the unique mode of being peculiar to intentional subjectivity, he also failed to engage adequately with the truly transcendental question concerning the condition of possibility for givenness as such. Little highlight here. Got a buddy, I need to ask about that later. I got a guy. In works succeeding Being and Time, Heidegger's own wrestling with these issues led him to question his own prior privileging of Dasein, whereas in Being and Time he still argued that a fundamental ontology must be rooted in human existence, and that we have to approach the ontological question via an investigation of Dasein's understanding of being. Heidegger subsequently came to hold the view that Dasein's own understanding is enabled by a more fundamental clearing, Lichtung, that belongs to itself, that belongs to being itself. As Heidegger writes in Letter on Humanism from 1946, the human being is not the lord of beings. The human being is the shepherd of being. Human beings lose nothing in this less. Rather, they gain in that they attain the truth of being. They gain the essential poverty of the shepherd, whose dignity consists in being called by being itself into the preservation of being's truth. So far, I have primarily been characterizing the development of phenomenology as an expansion of focus. One might, however, also describe the development in a somewhat different, more vertical manner. Phenomenology of the invisible. It has become customary to distinguish surface phenomenology from depth phenomenology, where the former focuses squarely on... Actually, I'm going to highlight that because that's some new phrasing for me. We'll give new phrasing blue. Blue's an interesting color. Green or blue? Which one's for interest? We'll make it blue. Whereas the former focuses squarely on the correlation between specific types of objects and specific intentional acts, it is also possible to proceed in a more radical manner. Sometimes, Husserl speaks of the need for an elaborate mining effort if one is to uncover and disclose how the intentional activity of the subject is founded upon and conditioned by various processes of passivity taking place in the underground or depth dimension of subjectivity. Husserl was well aware of the fact that any description of this passive and anonymous functioning dimension is beset with difficulties, mainly because the concepts we have at our disposal primarily originate from our interaction with worldly objects. One challenge is, consequently, to avoid importing too clear distinctions and overly objectifying structures and categories into our description of experiential life. Realizing these difficulties, Husserl at one point emphasized that the most fundamental dimension of subjectivity lies almost at the limit of possible description. More generally speaking, Husserl fully recognized that object intentionality, our consciousness, and preoccupation with objects doesn't exhaust the life of the mind, and indeed has various conditions of its own. Husserl's investigation into the structures of time consciousness is often viewed as his most radical attempt at characterizing and analyzing the most fundamental phenomenological dimension. One noteworthy feature of Husserl's extensive engagement with time consciousness is precisely that he eventually came to realize that there are other forms of manifestation than object manifestation, thereby also questioning the accuracy of Heidegger's criticism. And that the streaming of consciousness amounts to a form of temporal self-consciousness that is subjected to very different principles and structures than the manifestation of chairs and tables. Oof, that is so exciting to me. These are the kind of insights that I draw when speaking of AI and whether it can be conscious. Absolutely love it. In a famous remark in Being and Time, Heidegger observes that the specific task of phenomenology is to disclose that which first and foremost remains hidden from view. Indeed, it is exactly because there are phenomena that do not reveal themselves immediately that we are in need of phenomenology. Much later, in a conference from 1973, Heidegger explicitly speaks of the need for a phenomenology of the inapparent. The perhaps most sustained attempt to push the boundaries of phenomenology in this direction can be found in the work of Michael Henry, who sought to develop what has been called a phenomenology of the invisible. Hey Siri. Make a note. Michael Henry, Phenomenology of the Invisible.
Okay, I've created your note.
Thank you. Briefly put, Henry's idea... Ooh, I should highlight that too. Just Alright, we got a highlight. That bad boy is in pink. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Briefly put, Henry's idea was that subjectivity does not reveal itself in the light of the world, in the visibility of worldly exteriority. Pure subjectivity does not reveal itself as a worldly object and cannot be captured through categories pertaining to worldly experience. Rather, as Henry writes, the foundation is not something obscure, neither is it light, which becomes perceivable only when it shines upon the thing which bathes in its light. Nor is it the thing itself as a transcendent phenomenon, but it is an immanent revelation which is a presence to itself, even though such a presence remains invisible. Henry's suggestion is not that phenomenology should abandon the interest in manifestation and instead engage in unconstrained speculations. To speak of the invisible is, for him, not to speak of something which forever remains hidden. It is not to speak of that which never manifests itself, but to simply speak of something that manifests itself in a radically different manner than the visible. The idea that phenomenology has to move beyond an occupation and fixation with object intentionality and object manifestation is shared by most phenomenologists. This is so not only because our most fundamental self-acquaintance does not take the form of an object relation, but because our most fundamental relation to the world is not a relation to an object or a complex of objects, but also because our authentic relationship to the other is precisely a relation to someone that transcends our objectifying grasp. Although these ideas can already be found in rudimentary forms in Husserl, there is no question that later thinkers like Emmanuel Levinas, Michael Henry, Jacques Derrida, through their critical engagements with the classical phenomenological investigations of intentionality, time consciousness, and intersubjectivity, language, etc., radicalized the effort to disclose new types of manifestations, and thereby also made important contributions to the development of phenomenology. I am so curious. What differentiates what invisible and visible? Oh, I guess it's abandoning the Cartesian priors, so that's what I'm getting hung up on. Okay. It's not a matter of like epiphenomenal and phenomenal along terms of, Cartesian concepts. Okay. Cool. Alright, that's the end of that. Suggestions for further reading. Jacques Derrida, Violence and Metaphysics. An essay on the thought of Emmanuel Levinas. Ooh. I've been meaning to read some Levinas and Derrida, so let's highlight that bad boy. And we'll make you blue. Or pink. Merleau-Ponty and the Reversibility Thesis. I might have already read that. Fantastimundo.